to start with this provocation, I want to situate the debate about this research design. Traditionally, when we have research design in mostly any discipline, we discuss between quantitative and qualitative approaches. Most modern ways incorporate the possibility of mixing both and take the best part of both. But when we talk about this, also historically, we observed particular movements that push for enrich and purify this way of thinking. The quantitative methods and the objectivity that modern science has is a characteristic of the philosophical standpoint of modernity. In the middle of the 20th century, postmodernity questioned these assumptions and pushed for more grounded in feelings, discourses, and practices methods. This distinction is also part of our own history. And for example, Stephen Sheffin and Simon Schaeffer classic, The Leviathan and the Air Pump, talks about how science and politics were separated. These examples talk about the division that we create, not only in the construction of science and politics, but also in the ways that we approach to knowledge in the reality. Also, another classic is Bruno Latour with We Have Never Been Modern, that he discussed in the previous book, and he offers us a very interesting twist, saying that this division never exists. And he proposed that actually this division between object and subject actually is the description of networks of human and non-humans. And he called this a modernity. But a modernity offers us intellectually a challenge. That when we reject the existence of this division, we also reject the things that these two movements create in the ways of thinking. In particular, we say that the methods that we should have should be regrounded in this division that we artificially create. In this moment, we also have like a lot of different perspectives that talk about a new turn after the postmodernism. Some of them are classified in the post-postmodernist paradigms. There's a lot of different, a constellation of different points of view that construct different ways of describe the current ethos, the current zeitgeist of our times. One of them is a metamodernity. Metamodernity recognizes 7 particular characteristics that are fundamental in the way that the reality in the present happens. First, the altered globalization movement. Second, the right-wing populisms. Third, the 4th wave of terrorism war. 4, the awareness of Anthropocene. The financial crisis, the tech revolutions that Colin talks in his talk, and finally, a 4th quantum leap in capitalist production, or 4.0 industrial revolution that World Bank proposed. All of these things are the situated scenario that not only the metamodernists recognize, but also believe in them. And the metamodernist movement that initially begins in art propose that reality actually is an oscillation between modernity and postmodernity. This requires identify what was the advantage and disadvantage from both movements. And in one of the beginning of this movement that was has a long history, was nurtured between the first decade of this century, was synthesized in the Metamodernist Manifesto from Luke Turner in 2011. I want to rescue one of the points of this manifesto. It's point 7 that says, use as science a street for poetic elegance, artists might assume a quest for truth. All information is grounded in knowledge, whether empirical or aphoristic, no matters in true values. We should embrace the scientific poetic synthesis and informing naivety of a magical realism, errors with sense. More than the artist poetry that this fragment shows us, we can recognize a little taste of science and technology studies there. And in that way, when we define metamodernism, it's a structure of feelings that emerge from and react to the postmodern as such as cultural logic and correspondence today and a stage of global capitalism. In this point, we should be, I want to invite you to observe and think about what are the perspectives and the paradigms that we share as science and technology studies. In some way, Latour offers us an option and say like, actually, we live in the amodernism and we observe the reality before that, in the amodern perspective, like blurring the boundaries. But in other way, metamodernists tell us that actually we move between these both because they both exist. And these are contradictory positions because one put in the past of the modernity and postmodernity ways, and also in the past of quantitative and qualitative methods. And the metamodernists offer us a perspective that we are like weaving in interesting ways, in a ways of feelings, the method that we have. The mixed methods that we share are not only like assumed between the both previously, it's also a recreation and twisting of them. A very close friend of Bruno Latour is Jean Latour, and is one of the few scholars in STS that talk about the controversies that we create in the construction of methods. In his book in 2004, After Method, Mess in Social Science, he tries to address the controversies about approach, the difficulties and messy phenomena that science and technology create in these networks. Also, John Law, in the last handbook that was published in the last year of Science and Technology Study, has the inaugural essay that's called STS as method. And he put a point of view that offers that STS at itself has a method that he recognized in classic course. But he left a space open to understand what is that method. He described the current and the history that STS has, but he don't solve what is the kind of method that we have, and we share one each other. In that way, metamodernism allows us read in other ways that is not Latourian amodern ways, but is metamodern ways. What are the oscillations that we create in science and technology studies? In that way, this table summarizes the different assumptions that the STS people in very classic works recognize as assumptions from modern and postmodernist point of view, and then was twisted, were oscillated. The boundaries was broken to remain the perspective of them. And each paper that John Law selects in this chapter create an oscillation in the way of understanding. Not creates, don't go back to the pre-modern times. Go further on them. One example is the idea of Donna Haraway in his book of primates, that he observed that the assumption for the experimentalists that work with primates, with monkeys, was related to the experimentation justified unethical human practices for animal research, and she twisted putting a gender perspective in research, challenge the patriarchal science practices, and like expand through the ethnographic and qualitative and descriptive methods the previous quantitative scientific description of the primates in the laboratory. This waving between what is happening in them, between gender, between matriarchal and patriarchal, between non-human and human, is the movement that STS are doing all the time. In that way, I want to go back to Kuhn and observe that STS is making a lot of anomalies in the way that research methods are made. And that is like an epistemic and methodological problem that we have. Because when we want to describe how are the methods in STS, we mess a lot in themselves. Because if we go in the Latourian point of view of a modernity, we need to reject the need of methods and we go like previous times of the modernity and postmodernity. But if we go in the metamodern point of view, we can recognize these anomalies as oscillation that expands the points of view and challenge the previous assumption that both have. Don't challenge rejecting them, or like putting behind and say like, this distinction is false. It's taking the best of both and say, we need to move between, and in the space of between, in the boundaries spaces, is when we reside. Finally, we can say, and I'm bringing here a utilization that is called the metamodern condition. Let's say that as such, metamodernism includes many developments across art, science, politics, and culture. They're not even aware or know how they fit into art in metamodernism. And analyzing the work that we have in methods in STS, my proposal is that we actually are a manifestation of the metamodern times, that we recognize the previous conditions that modernists take care, and actually our methods are oscillation between the previous paradigms of quantitative and qualitative methods. In some way, STS methods are a future way to observe the messing reality. Finally, STS methods are in, on, and at metamodern knowledge space.